This is a tutorial all about counteroffers, how to structure them, how to fill them out properly, how to do them in the proper sequence. We're looking at 3 different counteroffers: a seller counteroffer, a seller multiple counteroffer, and a buyer counteroffer. We'll start with the seller counteroffer right here. So to fill it out, you'll begin by putting the date in the top right that you're drafting this form. So whatever today's date is on the date that you created. By default, it says this is a counteroffer to the purchase agreement. So we already know this is amending the purchase agreement. Dated, and then you want to put the date that's on the purchase agreement. So we're referencing the correct document that we're modifying with this counter. So you'll look up this date on the RPA. We'll put the property address, buyer's name, seller's name, and we move on. Now, keep in mind, with a counter, no matter how many counters keep stacking, it's implied that all the preceding terms are agreeable and carry over except for what's on the counter. So in this case, since we're countering an RPA, everything on the RPA, the purchase agreement, is agreeable except these 2 items. These are the modifiers. These are what change it. So we're putting under other terms, and I suggest itemizing numerically. Number 1, purchase price to be $990,000. This should have a little dollar sign here. Shame on me. Number 2, close of escrow to occur 30 days after acceptance. You can go on and on, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. If you run out of room, go ahead and check this box, addendum number 1, and then use the addendum for all the extra space that you need to add on additional terms. I see agents that write stuff like they'll restate terms that were already mentioned in the RPA or terms that should remain the same. That's redundant and it's extra verbiage that can just get confusing. There's no point in doing that. If you agree to everything else except these 2 items, you don't need to put it. It carries over. If you have a special arrangement, just read these forms right here, like tenant occupied property addendum, and you can check that box and add that additional form on. Ultimately, if this isn't enough, all you really need is an addendum. And if you have a special circumstance, you can elect to use one of these forms. By default, this counteroffer expires the 3rd day after the seller signs it and sends it to the buyer. Now, if you want to shorten that time frame to put pressure on the buyer to respond, you can put in a time of day here and even a date. So I could say like 5 p.m. or 6. I'd write 6 p.m. and then write tomorrow's date or the day after tomorrow's date. All right, there's just some disclaimer verbiage here, basically saying that the seller isn't obligated in certain matters while we're waiting to hear back from the buyer. Then the seller signs. If the buyer agrees to everything, the buyer signs this. And now if the buyer is going to counter, and we'll do a buyer counter in just a bit here, but the buyer still needs to sign this, but they must check this box because you have to create a sequence of forms. It's not like the buyer does a counteroffer and then this is never signed. It's always that you go purchase agreement, seller counteroffer number 1, then the buyer will counter that counteroffer number 1. Then the seller, if they want to counter again, they can do a seller counteroffer number 2. And then the buyer can counter that as a number 2, and it can keep escalating. But all those documents get signed. They're just when you check this box here, you're saying that the next document to come modifies this again, because the buyer might say, I'm fine with this, but I'm not fine with that. So when they check this box and go to a buyer counteroffer, so let's just say, for example, you're a buyer and you're fine with one of the items, but not the other. Check this box, do a buyer counter, and then you put whatever you want to modify here. So if you only want to change one thing, like the purchase price, you could just put the purchase price on there, and then everything else stays the same. So since we have the buyer counteroffer up, we'll go through it very quickly because it's very similar to the seller counteroffer. Date that you're drafting the form. This is a counteroffer to seller counteroffer number 1. Now, if these keep stacking, and for example, the seller wants to counter the buyer's counteroffer, that's why you have this number after it. Number 2, number 3, number 4, it can go on indefinitely. And then we have the property address, names of the parties, the terms that we're modifying. Now, I have 2 terms here just because I wrote it that way, but If we were actually countering that last counter and there was only one item we disagreed with, then we only need to change that one item. We don't need to restate anything. I'm just stressing that point. You probably get it by now, but I just see that mistake all the time, and it just makes it more confusing because then everyone has to look back at preceding documents and say, wait, I thought it already said that. I thought everyone already agreed on that. Did I misread the numerical figure on the last document? So that's why I'm bringing it up, just to make everyone's job easier. All right, and then same idea, expiration on the third date. The buyer's going to sign, and the seller's going to sign if they agree, or if the seller wants to do a counteroffer number 2, seller's going to check this box, and they're going to add their counteroffer right here, and it's going to continue on. Because again, everyone's signing the RPA, everyone's signing all the counters, nothing gets left out. They just have to check these boxes. And there's a box to check if you're countering an RPA too. So when the seller does a seller counter offer number 1 on the RPA, the seller's still signing the RPA, but they're checking a box just like this, subject to the attached seller counter offer. So we'll jump over to the seller multiple counter offer. That's the wild card and the final counter we're looking at. Quickly, I want to say, if you're interested in 100% commission, unlimited transactions, no limit on the sales price, just $49 a month, then check out openhometeam.com. Open Home is 100% commission brokerage. E&O is included, no transaction fee, just $49 a month. And if you go to openhometeam.com/join, you can find out more information. Seller multiple counteroffer. Basically the same as the first counteroffer. The only difference, and just to save time, I won't go through this because at this point you know it by now, is there's an additional section here. So the seller signs, it goes out to the buyer for the buyer to sign. But wait, when the buyer signs it, they're not in agreement. They don't have a fully executed document. This requires a second seller signature in order to be fully executed. And here's the reason. The seller sends out 3 counteroffers to 3 buyers. Well, what happens if all 3 buyers sign that they agree and send it back? The seller's in trouble. They just triple committed themselves to a single transaction, which is impossible. The idea of the seller multiple counteroffer is it requires that second seller counter signature that basically allows the seller to get all the buyer signed counters back and then choose which one that they're signing. So that way another buyer can't claim that they're the true buyer and the seller has to move forward with them. Only the buyer that has the second seller's signature on it. So that's the little plot twist with the seller multiple counteroffer. It's the same as the normal SCO or seller counteroffer, but there's this box 8 that requires it go back to the seller. So if you're a buyer's agent you get a seller multiple counteroffer, well, your buyer's going to sign it, but that's not the end of the story. You need to inform your buyer that the seller needs to sign a second time, and you need to get on top of that listing agent and really push for that seller to sign off on your signed counter as soon as possible. Because until that seller signs this a second time, your buyer is still out in the cold with all the other buyers and there's no deal. So that's the important factor on the seller multiple counteroffer. I do hope you found this video helpful. Thank you for watching.